evening. Hello, ladies and gentlemen. We are very pleased to welcome you to our tonight's talk, Rhetoric, Truth and Enjoyment, Cicero Beyond the Pleasure Principle, by Paul L. Miller, who is our Fulbright Freud Visiting Lecturer of Psychoanalysis 2024. Before I start to introduce our speaker and explain the evening's program, I would like to give the word to Dr. Hermann Agis from Fulbright, Austria. So.
Thank you. Welcome
Yeah.
here, if you may. So, I hope you hear me. Yeah. My name is Hermann Agis, Fulbright, Austria, and it's a pleasure to have you, Ellen, here with me. I will just turn a bit the microphone so that we see you. That's why we are here. Yeah. And so a warm welcome and servus from Fulbright, Austria. We have a long-lasting relations with the Freud Museum here. I think the first time we got in contact and got this kind of this agreement together was in 1997. So a long relationship with many Fulbright professors coming here to this wonderful location. And also, personally, I would like to share a relationship with the museum. I remember my first time coming here when I was like this, yeah, so small, in the Wiener Ferienspiel. And they had a tour through the museum, and that was my introduction to Freud and how Freud influenced the Austrian society. So I always encourage people to come with the kids, and always when I walk through the museum and I see the boxes where it's Freud for kids, I'm always reminded of my first visit here. So come with your family here. The Fulbright Commission, Fulbright Austria, is a binational commission. For everybody who doesn't know us, we are funded by Austria and the United States of America to bring both countries a bit closer together. So what we support is mutual understanding. That's our mission. Mutual understanding between the peoples of Austria and the United States of America. And how do we do this? We do this with bright minds, and many of them are here today, like you and in the audience here, which we send from Austria to the United States and from America to Austria to study, to teach as teaching assistants, or to lecture and teach our students in Austrian universities or US universities, or to do research. So this is what we do to bring Austria and America a bit closer together. And in addition to that, we also advise students, Austrian students, how to study in the US as Education USA Advising Center. And we bring, with the US Teaching Assistantship Program, about 160 US teaching assistants to Austrian high schools to teach our young bright minds in our high school the proper English, American English. So it's great to see all of you here who convey the American way of life in Austria, and I'm already interested to learn about Cicero and pleasure, and so I hand it over back to you.
Thank you. Thank you. I didn't know about your personal relationship with the museum, and it's good to know, and I can also just tell you, please come to the museum and have a look at these boxes for children, and also listen to those poems, which are really great. And yes, we do have now a program for children. Yes, as you hear, I hadn't had the chance at school to have a Fulbright teaching assistant, so you hear my Austrian English. But let me just tell you that yes, as we heard already, this collaboration or cooperation has a long history. The first Fulbright scholar came in 1999, so we had around 25 experts from different fields, from the humanities, from medicine, from neurology, in these last years. Let's call them Freud scholars, who came to Vienna, spent the summer term here at the Freud Museum, and gave a lecture, of course here too, but gave a course at the University of Vienna. And it's the first time that, and this is with you, Alan, that we had an expert and a professor for classics and comparative literature. So let me start to introduce Alan. Paul L. Miller is the Carolina Distinguished Professor there's something missing, of classics and comparative literature, and also the distinguished guest professor of English at Ava Women's University in Seoul, in South Korea. His fields of research and publications are the intellectual relations, between the ancient world and modern philosophy and theory, with an emphasis on psychoanalysis. Professor Miller has published quite a lot on these topics, more than 10 monographies, 15 anthologies, and more than 100 articles. So if we count monographies and anthologies together with 100 articles, it's like Freud. Huh? His latest book, which is entitled Theory Does Not Exist, Comparative Ancient and Modern Explorations in Deconstruction, Psychoanalysis and Rhetoric, came just out a few weeks ago. And during his stay in Vienna, he was doing research on the next book, which is entitled Truth and Enjoyment in Cicero, Rhetoric and Philosophy Beyond the Pleasure Principle, which is also the first major psychoanalytic treatment of this topic. During the fellowship in Vienna, he has been teaching a course, the subject of enjoyment and antiquity, at the Department of Classical Philology, Medieval and Neo-Latin Studies at the University of Vienna. And let me tell you that Alan attended also nearly all sessions of our Ringvorlesung, Freud und die Antike, which took place here every Monday evening this summer term. And I can tell you he was our most inspiring, not student, but participant, always enriching the discussion by his comments or questions, but mostly also by his so kind and friendly and witty way of sharing his ideas and reflections. And I enjoyed it a lot, and I would like to thank you for being so often with us. Yes, so after the lecture, which will probably last around 60 minutes, you will have the possibility to enter in discussion with Professor Alan Miller. And now, the floor is yours.
Thank you. So thank you, everybody, for taking time out of your summer to come to a lecture. What you'll be hearing is, in fact, a modified version of the introduction to the book manuscript that I completed while I was here. So you'll hear some references to the book at times, which I went ahead and left in because generally when I reference other Cicero texts that I will be dealing with, that seemed important to leave in. But let's dive right in. When Donald Trump was elected, I watched cable news incessantly. I couldn't stop. I was so afraid that I would miss some revelation that would bring him down or a cataclysmic disaster that he caused. My behavior was delusional. It was based on the premise that if I could know the truth, if the truth could be revealed, then I could exercise some control, that the repeated trauma being inflicted on our collective psyches could be mastered. I was not powerless. I, alone, could fix it. In some way, the world, or at least my world, depended on my knowledge. It was a classic paranoid delusion shared by countless friends and acquaintances, and equally by my ideological foes, the people I feared, who sat glued to Fox News, enraptured and titillated by QAnon stories. Where was the truth? How could we know it? How could we reveal the lies of our opponents? How could we save our flawed republic before it descended into tyranny, anarchy, or fascism? These were our animating questions. This was the structure of our enjoyment. This was our compulsion to repeat. Nonetheless, our delusion was not without its own truth. The exercise of power depends on access to and the ability to articulate truths, not just as facts, though power needs and produces facts, but also as statements of experience, of values, of fears, and of desires. no power can be exercised without at least an implicit statement of truth. X is the case. Liberal elites despise us. Taxes inhibit economic growth. And so Y must, should, will follow. Populist revolt, neoliberal economic policy. Likewise, no power can be exercised without a knowledge of its object, polling data, bureaucratic procedure. Equally, no resistance can exist that does not make a counterclaim, that does not have a thesis about what it seeks to resist. But our relation to these truths, or statements of truths, as our recent experience of pandemics, the climate crisis, and disinformation only too well attest, is never simply that of disinterested observation, the testing of a proposition, or the accumulation of evidence. Truth is, in fact, an experience. It is corporeal. It is a set of actions we perform in defined institutional and social settings, an overdetermined mode of relating to ourselves, a way of forming and understanding ourselves in relation to the world. Our experience and performance of the truth is situated and embodied in ways that necessarily transcend any sort of psychologistic or neoliberal reduction to a mere calculation of costs and benefits, incentives and disincentives, pleasure and pain. Our experience of truth is not reducible to the data points contained, constructed, and deployed within our propositions. We seek truths that shape us and confirm us, as well as truths that shake us to our cores. We seek truths that take us beyond ourselves, a sublime truth that threatens both to annihilate and affirm who we are and what we want to be. We must acknowledge that many of these truths are non-scientific, but science too is a process with its own social and political institutions and compensations. These do not exist outside their own structures of articulation, contestation, verification, and enjoyment. Science is always an imperfectly realized ideal. In 57 BCE, Cicero returned from exile. Having survived the civil wars of Marius and Sulla and the ensuing proscriptions, in which over 9,000 Roman citizens were killed, he became consul in 63 BCE. A new man without the family ties or deeply rooted alliances common among his peers. His weapons were his knowledge and his eloquence. Catiline, a failed consular candidate who was deep in debt, plotted a coup. There were rumors everywhere. Cicero tracked down their sources, gathered documents and intelligence, and exposed it before the Senate. Catiline was forced to flee, and the Republic was saved. But Catiline was not alone. What of those left behind? Arrests were made. There was no time for a trial. Catiline and his supporters were gathering in the hills north of Rome. Julius Caesar called for imprisoning them in the surrounding towns. Cato then spoke and convinced the Senate that path was too dangerous. If the Republic was to be saved, they must be put to death. Cicero led them to the Carcer, had them strangled, and was hailed Pater Patriae, the father of his country, only to be exiled in 58 for putting citizens to death without trial. In the period immediately after his exile, with the Roman Republic dominated by a trio of strong men, Caesar, Pompey, and Crassus, Cicero published two major dialogues, De Oratore and De Republica. In De Oratore, set in the Latin holidays during a previous crisis of the Republic, Crassus argues that the ideal orator, Cicero's ego ideal, must be the master of all knowledge. He contends that the orator and the philosopher must be one, and that you can only sway your audience, you can only control the situation if you know the truth and the truth of men's souls. Marcus Antonius argues for a more practical and applied oratory, but he too ultimately contends that every successful orator must speak the truth. He must know the truth, and that truth must possess him in the moment of speaking with a trembling of the body and an all but orgasmic ecstasy, as it must also his opponent. The truth must be reflected by the discourse of the orator, and the truth itself is literally embodied in the orator. In De Republica, Scipio argues that the statesman, the pilot of the ship of state, must master all branches of knowledge, from astronomy to history, from mathematics to the civil law, from philosophy to rhetoric. But only if he has such mastery can he guide the republic through the many dangers that threaten it on all sides, dangers that are narrated in the more historical parts of the dialogue. Only if he has such mastery can he transcend the narrow confines of the self and fully dedicate himself to the state. Only thus can he become one with the state and achieve the immortality and sublime enjoyment imagined in the finality of the dialogue, the somnium Scipionis, the dream of Scipio. Cicero wrote these dialogues in the wake of his greatest political achievements and at the moment of his greatest humiliation and destitution. The republic he came back to was not the one he left. His political role was diminished, and he would operate henceforth in the shadow of the strong men until he would have one last brief efflorescence after Caesar's assassination, before Mark Antony had him killed, with his tongue and hand cut off and nailed to the rostrum as Antony's retort to the Philippics. In this space of destitution during the 50s, he produced two of his greatest political and philosophical works, Fantasies of Mastery, Fantasies of Complete Knowledge, truly remarkable and beautiful paranoid structures of enjoyment, which, as we shall see, is something more than just pleasure. At the same time, they are fantasies of death. Both dialogues are set in the midst of past political crisis. When within a few years, all but one of the speakers in De Oratore are dead, many killed in the violence unleashed at the beginning of the social wars, when Rome's allies in Italy revolted and demanded Roman citizenship. In De Republica, Scipio dies the day after the dialogue is supposed to have taken place. The final image of the somnium, of the dream, was Scipio discussing the immortality of the soul and listening to the music of the spheres, is prophetic. I want to contend that the basic questions of Cicero poses in these dialogues, as well as in his final philosophical and political works of the 40s, have never been more urgent. How can we know the truth? How can we persuade others of the truth? What is the relation between the truth and persuasive power? What is the relation between philosophy as the pursuit of truth and rhetoric as the power to sway and hence to govern others? And how is it that we can use our ability to persuade others in order to resist tyranny, to preserve a flawed and fragile republican form of government, in which the contest for truth, and hence the ability to persuade others of the truth, is not foreclosed? This last question, for both Cicero and for us, is particularly pressing. For implicit in Cicero's argument and explicit in the thesis of this book is that the existence of such a structure of governance is the condition of possibility on which the pursuit of and contest for truth, and hence the exercise of persuasion, rests. Beyond it, and often underneath it as a hidden substructure, is the naked violence of force. At the same time, the pursuit of truth is never a fully rational activity. It is performed by embodied subjects who are always embedded in histories of power, government, and language, subjects who are subject to needs, desires, and drives they do not fully master, and those needs, desires, and drives are, in the final analysis, both constitutive of the truth we seek, who and what we are, and the objects of persuasion we must manipulate. These are not merely abstract questions posed by traditional philosophy, rhetoric, and the psychoanalytic tradition. They are not merely historical as found in Cicero's texts. They are existential in the most profound sense. They impinge directly on our lived experience. In Plato's Apology, Socrates imagines that the jurors who have just convicted him of a capital crime might ask, could he not live quietly? Could he not cease his daily interactions with his fellow citizens in the pursuit of truth and the limits of knowledge, interactions that embarrassed and discomforted those very citizens with their persistence and intensity? Socrates responds that not only would this be to disobey the God who he believes has given him this task, but also that, quote, the greatest good for a human being is each day to make arguments, words, speeches, logos, the Greek word means all three of those, about excellence, and about the other things you hear me conversing on, both examining and testing myself and others. The unexamined life is not livable for a human being. This is, of course, a very famous passage. Philosophia for Socrates is not a profession. It is not a set of technical problems to be solved. It is a form of life, and the essence of that life is the coming to consciousness of the human being through a commitment to the logos, reason, speech, the giving of an account, in an agonistic setting of mutual examination and refutation. This activity is what makes us most fully human. There is nothing in this Socratic statement of principle with which Cicero would disagree. He would, however, make one further argument that Socrates of the Apology does not. For Cicero, the life of the logos, this world of speech in which truth is pursued through a vigorous contest between forms of language, in which speakers themselves become transformed by that contest, a sort of talking cure, one might say, whether in a law court, the Senate, the forum, or a philosophic dialogue, is one that can only be fully realized within a republic. That is to say, only within a constitutional form that positions itself in opposition to tyranny and autocracy. Yet this true life, imagined by the Platonic Socrates, and as we shall see, by Cicero, a life fully realized through the logos, is not the ideal world of post-Cartesian scientific truth. The truth for Cicero, as for the Platonic Socrates, is not separate from our experience of it. It does not exist as an abstract set of axioms that can be recorded, quantified, and separated from the act of their enunciation. The recording or inclusion of factually accurate statements, abstracted from the act and context of veridiction itself, and hence of its reception and validation, does not make those statements or the medium in which they appear necessarily true. This is the essence of Plato's critique of the book written by Dionysius the Younger in the 7th letter. He does not say that any given statement in the book is false. Indeed, each one could be individually true, just as in certain forms of propaganda, in which individual propositions themselves are accurate, even if their import or their total significance may effectively be a lie. Rather, what Plato indicts here is the abstraction of these statements from the living context of philosophical inquiry, from the back and forth of the dialogic process with its necessary friction, the tribe that produces the spark of enlightenment, that produces the consciousness of a lived truth in the moment of its speaking, its testing, its refutation, and its confirmation. This is not the truth of a disembodied punctual cogito, abstracted from space and time, whose every experience and perception must be bracketed with doubt. This is a truth, as Plato describes it, produced between real speakers interacting with one another. It is, in a real sense, an unrepeatable truth, one whose essence is not its infinite iterability and unchanging identity, regardless of speaker, but its incessant dialectic between a referentiality that transcends the immediate and our unrepeatable immediate experience of that transcendence. My book is about how Cicero models, struggles with, and ultimately helps us to understand the crisis and ultimate collapse of the Roman Republic. It begins a fundamental re-examination of the relation between truth and embodied enjoyment as understood in the traditional confrontation between rhetoric and philosophy in Cicero. His simultaneous advocacy of a classical rationality and his continued emphasis on the importance of performativity and enjoyment in language, on ratio as a desire, cupiditas, and force, vis, in the real, situates him at the crossroads of reason and the unconscious. Where the modern post-Cartesian concept of truth abstracts truth from the subjective experience of both speaker and hearer, for Cicero, truth is inseparable from our experience of it. And it is precisely the possibility of their separation that he criticizes in works like De Oratore, where he seeks an ideal reconciliation between rhetoric and philosophy. This work examines the problem of enjoyment, jouissance, as central to understanding the ongoing, seemingly intractable argument between rhetoric and philosophy. I distinguish pleasure from enjoyment, with pleasure always being balanced by the constraints of the reality principle, and hence always open to rational substitution and deferral. Pleasure exists within the realm of the calculable. Yes, I would like more chocolate ice cream. No, that's too much. Jouissance, however, is a drive that leads beyond the utilitarian calculus, balancing pleasure against unpleasure, seeking a form of radical experience that can be both sublime and destructive, an experience that calls into question the trusted verities of the reality principle. The present inquiry will avail itself of a wide range of theoretical models, including both Foucauldian concepts of the history of truth and Freud's understanding of what he labels the death drive, Todestrieb, as well as Lacan's interpretation of the same. It should, however, be admitted that there is nothing magical about these theoretical instruments. They do not produce unquestioned truths. What they do offer is the ability to think more carefully about issues that are raised within the Ciceronian text, to define with precision the terms and stakes in questions, hence to allow us to speak more clearly about the importance of those texts to our lives. There has never been a major psychoanalytic treatment of Cicero, and while we must beware of crude attempts to psychoanalyze a long-dead author, Freud's hermeneutic model can provide insights into Cicero's investment in concepts of enjoyment, desire, the sublime, and the abject, as well as into how those concepts undergird his understanding of rational and philosophical appeals to his audience. The conflict between rhetoric and philosophy dates to at least the 5th century BCE. It has often been understood as a conflict between a discourse that speaks to desire and a discourse that speaks to truth. In the Gorgias, Socrates compares the rhetor to the pastry chef who tempts the sick person to their peril, while the philosopher is the doctor whose bitter gall leads to death, or leads to health. Boy, that was a Freudian slip. Cicero is situated squarely at the nexus between these figures, and as he has Crassus argue in De Oratore, Book 3, we live a more impoverished existence since those functions of discourse, philosophy, and rhetoric, truth and desire, have been split apart. In Crassus's vision, they can only be healed in the figure of the ideal orator to come. It is thus no accident that the De Oratore situates itself as a response to, and in a certain sense a completion of, the Gorgias. It will be helpful in examining the opening. It will be helpful to examine the opening of De Officiis to see how Cicero himself frames the stakes of his argument. Here Cicero specifies that what distinguishes human beings from beasts is the pursuit of truth. But this pursuit is not in opposition to our appetites and desires, he makes clear. It is rather what characterizes those appetites and desires as human. The human is an animal who uses the force of reason to seek the truth and to satisfy his desires for knowledge and preeminence. Quote, among the first things proper to the human is the search for and investigation of the true. When we are free from attending to necessities, businesses, and cares, then we desire, awemus, to see, to hear, or to learn something. And we consider the knowledge of things, whether secret or wondrous, necessary to living well. From this it is understood that what is true, simple, and genuine is most apt to human nature. In addition to this desire, cupiditati, for seeing the true, there is a certain hunger, appetitio, for preeminence. So that the well-formed soul does not wish to obey anyone except someone who is instructing or teaching justly for the sake of what is useful and commanding legitimately, whence arises a greatness of soul and contempt of human affairs. Only that force, vis, of nature and reason, rationis, and truly that force of nature and reason is not small, because only this animal senses what order may be, what is fitting, and what may be the limit in words and deeds. If we step back a minute from the abstract meaning of the argument here presented and attend to what it actually says, to the individual words, that is, if we assume the position of the analyst who examines patterns of signification in the discourse of the analysand, it is clear that Cicero argues the essence of the human, what differentiates it from beast, is a desire for truth, a hunger for preeminence, and a recognition that phenomena manifest themselves in our nature and through our reason as a force or even violence, vis. It can be translated both ways. Indeed, for Cicero, I argue, the search for the true that characterizes the human is never simply a pursuit of the ideal, but is inextricably entangled with the sexualization of our struggle for preeminence, our desire for the remarkable, and the pursuit of enjoyment. The force, vis, of an argument in the end is both its meaning and its ability to move us, to make us act, to exercise a form of power over our thoughts and actions. In what remains, I will first outline in more detail how I understand the psychoanalytic concept of enjoyment. I will then offer a sample reading of selected passages from the Catalanarians to further concretize the nature of the phenomena under investigation. Start off with a quote from Nestor Brownstein. Why does cultural production adhere to these uncanny creations? And why do these horrific representations have the importance they do if man's imaginary is governed by the pleasure principle? The pleasure principle is the bedrock of most psychological theories, whether behaviorist, Freudian, or cognitive. The basic assumption is that people do things that give themselves pleasure and avoid things that produce pain, discomfort, or anxiety. These same psychological assumptions underlie utilitarianism, classical economics, game theory, and most of our normative conceptions of rationality. People pursue behaviors that maximize pleasure and avoid those that cause pain, resulting in trade-offs and substitutions as one often accepts a lesser or deferred pleasure in return for being able to potentially avoid a painful consequence. Freud calls these two poles the pleasure and the reality principles. They are not opposites, but complements. The reality principle is a limit placed on pleasure to ensure that we are able to continue to pursue it in an unmolested fashion. In an ideal environment where each of us possess the same opportunities, the same information, and the same calculative ability, according to this model, we would all make the same choices. And yet we know this is not true. People engage in all sorts of behaviors that neither procure them pleasure, at least not in the normative sense, nor maximize utility. They do so often with full knowledge of the consequences. Entire swaths of cultural production are predicated on our fascination with sexualized violence and death. from tragedy to opera to horror. At the same time, people develop compulsions they know are self-destructive. People knowingly engage in high-risk sexual behaviors. Children of abuse compulsively inflict that abuse on others. We have an insatiable need for spectacles of violence, from gladiators to mixed martial arts to splatter films. It's the horrific auto accident you can't turn away from. It's the millions of people in the United States who, while claiming to be horrified by pedophiles, spend countless hours obsessing over internet fantasies of pedophiles and child cannibals secretly ruling the world. QAnon. It's the thrill of the rampaging, murderous mob. This set of phenomena, their traumatic origins, the search for control through repetition, and the ultimate inability of these compulsions to be accounted for by a rational utilitarian calculus of pleasure are the focus of Freud's Beyond the Pleasure Principle. Beyond the Pleasure Principle is written in 1920 in the aftermath of World War I, at the same time as Freud is composing his famed essays on the uncanny and a child is being beaten. What all these essays ask us is, how do we explain uncanny and horrific cultural productions if the imaginary, if our pre-linguistic sense of self is governed by the pleasure principle? Brownstein writes, why would the subject repeat nightmares that show him harassed, with no recourse, the object of cruelty and abuse? Freud names this force the death drive, Todestrieb. It is not a desire in a normal sense. It cannot be satisfied. It's not like wanting a bowl of ice cream, having one, and feeling better. Nor is it a desire that remains empirically unsatisfied. It is an unending obsession. It is a movement towards a form of subjective dissolution and reconstitution, a threatening violation of the boundaries of the self, a form of paroxystic suffering and enjoyment that leads through repetition to a reconstitution of the self and its identity, when it does not actually result in self-destruction. Again from Brownstein. If life is defined beginning with an inscription in the structure of subjectivity, which are transactions with the other, that is, starting from the flesh, becoming body due to the interference of the signifier in the vital processes, the movement of the drives can be seen as the force that propels the recovery of a state before the word, or the recovery of the thing as the absolute object of desire, a jouissance of being from which the subject comes to exist. At its simplest level, it is the story of Freud's grandson, Ernst, compulsively reenacting his own fear of abandonment through the Fort Da game, and feeling comfort in the repetition. The drives are incredibly powerful forces. They motivate behavior, war, rage, the savagery of self-harm, without those motivations ever being reducible to a game-theoretical model of comparative advantage. They exist not as either the opposite or object of reason, but as its obscene obverse, the smear of enjoyment that motivates, shapes, and channels the logoi of embodied, empirically existent human beings. The death drive both lies behind and is the object of our rhetorical interventions, our arguments, our will to know. The drive's aim is insistence and repetition, a telos that is never fully realized. This aim is denominated by Jacques Lacan's jouissance, which I translate enjoyment to distinguish it from pleasure, with a sideways glance to the Latin gaudium that possesses a similar sexual ambiguity. Where pleasure operates within the law, respects decency and moderation, jouissance is always a form of ecstatic transgression that by definition knows no satisfaction and cannot be reduced to rational expression. It is literally unspeakable, a kind of shudder. For Lacan, enjoyment beyond the pleasure principle finds its archetypal expression in the figure of Antigone. Lacan devoted a large portion of his seventh seminar on the ethics of psychoanalysis to a reading of the Antigone. The Antigone is for him the ultimate psychoanalytic text. It poses a question only psychoanalysis can answer. Why does Antigone refuse to accede to Creon's decree forbidding the burial of Polynices? Why does she knowingly and willingly embrace death? Our everyday bargaining between the pleasure and the reality principles can neither account for her action nor its continuing appeal. When the play opens, Antigone confronts her sister Ismene with the news that Creon has decreed their brother's body is to be left unburied. She and Ismene are conceived in this speech as a unit, not separate individuals, but one substance from a common womb, auta delphan, the womb that is the origin of Oedipus's evils. The experiential reality of that union, however, is characterized by the presence of ate, defined paratactically in lines 4 and 5 as pain, shame, and dishonor. Ate appears 14 times in the play. It denotes both a limit and a space beyond, quote, the horrifying, lethal, and at the same time fascinating borderline that we approach when the reversal into bliss is imminent. That's from Zizek. According to the chorus, it represents an inhuman desire that causes one to misrecognize good and evil, to misrecognize pleasure. It represents a border upon whose crossing greatness is predicated, but beyond which one cannot live. Far-ranging hope is a source of pleasure for many. For others, the trickery of nimble desire creeps up on the man knowing nothing before he should burn his foot on the hot fire. From this, in wisdom, a small saying appears. The bad then seems good to one whose entrails the god turns towards ate. He acts for only a short time beyond ate. Antigone directs herself towards ate. Her desire is outside, ektos, the limits of the human, a return to the oneness of the flesh, a desire which is beyond desire itself and into the drive. For her, the philoi are the dear, are those who share the bonds of the flesh. She will lie philae with Philos in Polynices' grave, not because his cause was just, but just because he is who he is. She tells us a husband or son can be replaced, but a brother is irreplaceable. In this world, there is no possible exchange or substitution, no bargaining, no way to fill the gap caused by the death of her brother within the domain sanctioned by the pleasure and reality principles. This self-enclosed world is beyond the law Creon seeks to instantiate by forbidding the burial of Polynices. In her choice of death, Antigone rejoins the incestuous beyond that submerges individuality, a region whose economy cannot be measured by the calculus of the pleasure principle. This implacable insistence, this drive, Lacan argues, is the source of her beauty, the beauty of tragedy generally. Lacan refers to this beauty as Antigone's éclat, or splendor. It is she who fascinates us in her unbearable splendor, in the way she holds us and forbids us, in the sense that this intimidates us, in the way she is disconcerting, this so terribly voluntary victim. Her beauty is both endlessly fascinating and horrifying, like the death drive itself. It is a form of unspeakable enjoyment that speaks to our alienation and separation, our desire for the illegal, the excessive, and traumatic. It is a tear or hole in the symbolic fabric of the world that would render our separate subjective existence impossible. It is something we desire and despise. It threatens our existence, and as recognized individuals in a law-bound community, it endlessly beckons as the possibility of absolute transcendence and the end of desire. While strictly speaking, enjoyment beyond the pleasure principle is unspeakable, one of the ways it manifests itself within symbolic structures is the as the abject or the grotesque. The grotesque is often associated through the work of Mikhail Bakhtin with the carnivalesque. As Bakhtin himself, however, acknowledges, the grotesque in satire, rather than leading to celebratory regeneration in the form of carnival gaiety, leads to the dissolution and destruction of the intended target. In this, it is closely related to the concept of the abject developed by Julia Kristeva, who was among the first scholars to introduce Bakhtin's thought to the West and a psychoanalytic thinker working in the wake of Lacan. The abject is that which repulses us. It reminds us of our material contingency, the unsealed and threatened nature of our bodies, blood, semen, excrement. It is a source of fascination and aggression. It is not an object per se, but the evocation through jouissance of a pre-objectal world, a world before our existence as autonomous beings operating within the bounds of laws and norms. The abject manifests within the normative world as something beyond it, and hence threatening it, as something fascinating and repugnant. A proper identity cuts us off, separates us from an unlimited jouissance, from a paroxystic enjoyment that has the power to dissolve the bonds between self and other. Such an unspeakable enjoyment threatens to destroy the possibility of a regulated exchange between the pleasure-motivated ego and the world that enfolds and threatens it. Abjection is the process of separation that creates defined subjects and objects, selves and others, and the abject is a return of the repressed, a moment when what had to be expelled returns. Quote, abjection is a resurrection that passes through the death of the ego. It is an alchemy that transforms the death drive into a surge of life, of new meaning. The ironic pendant or complement of the abject is the sublime, which at first blush seems its opposite. Nonetheless, the sublime in both Kant and Burke is an experience that exceeds and threatens the bounds of subjective existence, producing a fracture or moment of ontological rupture that does violence to the imagination. The sublime, as Henry Sussman observes, in its, quote, unmediated being there, anticipates the Lacanian real, a register of existence beyond both symbolic norms and imaginary identities. The sublime is a moment beyond the law and beyond the pleasure principle that can be both erotic and criminal. It simultaneously terrifies and thrills with an awareness of the close proximity of life to death. There is a level of analysis, then, in which the tragic, the sublime, and the abject coincide in their eroticization of the boundaries of subjective existence and of their transgression. It is the dialectic between this phenomenon of sublime enjoyment and a commitment to classical rationality in Cicero that we must explore. There's a quote from the second Catilinarian. Surely amidst the ashes of the city and the blood of citizens, which in their wicked and criminal hearts they long for, they will not aspire to become consuls, dictators, even kings. Surely they must see that if they succeed in obtaining the offices they covet, they only end up having to hand them over to some runaway slave or gladiator. In 64 BCE, Marcus Tullius Cicero, a new man from the provincial town of Arpinum, was elected one of the 2 yearly consuls of Rome for the next year. Catiline was one of his defeated opponents. He was descended from one of the oldest patrician families in Rome. In the next year's election, when Catiline ran again and again was defeated, he gathered about him a group of conspirators, many from the lower classes of Rome, the landless, the indebted, as well as fellow aristocrats down on their luck. They launched a plan to assassinate Cicero and overthrow the government, setting fires throughout the city. The conspiracy was exposed before the Senate and then before the Roman people by Cicero in a series of famous speeches known as the Catilinarians. From the opening of Cicero's first Catilinarian, we are asked to imagine to participate in and then repulse a congery of orgiastic frenzy and decadence. How far, I ask you, Catiline, do you mean to stretch your patience? How much longer will your frenzy, furor, continue to frustrate us? Furor is a loaded word in Latin. In Virgil's Aeneid, it implies at once the dangerous individualistic heroism of the Greek hero, an Ajax or an Achilles, rather than the dutiful submission of a Pius Aeneas, and the mad sexuality of a Dido, or of pacifies illicit passion for the bull. It is at once heroic, if problematic, and deeply perverse. In Catullus, it is the frenzy that drives Attis to castrate himself in devotion to Cybele. Such a frenzy is not limited to a single individual. That would be a matter for the Senate. That would not be a matter for the Senate. Rather, it is characteristic of the moment, a sign of broader social decline and depravity. O tempora, o mores. What a decadent age we live in, Barry translates. This furor is a contagion. There follows a brief section in which Cicero says, he could, but will not seek Catiline's immediate death, citing past instances of summary executions, including when a senatorial gang beat Tiberius Gracchus and 300 of his followers to death, after the tribune passed a law giving public lands illegally occupied by aristocratic families to the poor. Cicero follows this opening with a stunning praeteritio, a rhetorical device in which the speaker lists a series of topics he will not discuss, even as he introduces them. The praeteritio offers the perfect combination of character assassination and plausible deniability. From what lust, libido, have your eyes? From what crime have your hands ever abstained? From what outrage has any part of your body ever abstained? Is there any youth, adolescentulus, that you have not ensnared with the enticements of corruption, whom you have not then gone on to provide with a weapon to commit a crime or a torch to fire his lusts? Or again, when you recently made your house ready for a new bride by bringing about the death of your previous wife, did you not compound this crime with yet another that is quite incredible? But I will pass over this and let it be veiled in silence, because I do not want such a monstrous crime to appear either to have been committed in our country or to have been committed and not punished. I will also pass over the financial ruin which you will find hanging over you on the 13th of this month when loans come due. This is a brilliant and vicious piece of invective. The passage begins with Catiline's libido. While the word does not yet have the precise Freudian gloss it will later possess, it strongly connotes desire and illicit pleasures. We are invited to imagine what Catiline's eyes lust to gaze upon. Is he a voyeur? Does he like to watch? Or does he also like to touch with his hands? How does his sight relate to his lust and his hands? What does he do with the other parts of his body? All these questions are posed by the first lines of this passage. As we continue reading, it seems he likes boys. He traps them, literally throws a net over them, in retire, having lured them with charms and decoys, in lecibri, as one would a bird or small animal. What does he do with these pets once he ensnares them? He gives them a sword, ferrous, so they can cut throats and purses, or he fires their lust with a torch. In this one sentence, we move from seduction to murder and back again, creating a unity of violence and perversion that are at the core of how we are to imagine Catiline and his crimes. We slide then from murders committed by the boys, whom Catiline entraps, to the murder of his previous wife, as we travel along the associative chain of sexualized violence. As the commentators have observed, there is no evidence that Catiline committed this murder or the other one Cicero hints at darkly. But we will not talk about this. Cicero's sense of shame forbids him mentioning what he is mentioning. The existence of evidence of dastardly crimes is hinted at, but then putically withdrawn. I will pass over this. The praeteritio performs a kind of tease, a way of luring with charms and decoys that leads us deeper into the associative labyrinth, deeper into the world of our imaginative enjoyment that we simultaneously hold at a distance. We are able both to be Catiline and judge Catiline. And well, we won't even talk about how much money he owes. Roman morality strongly associated sexual and monetary continence. Examples could be multiplied from the speech. The entire oration proceeds in much the same manner. Let us turn our attention, however, to the second Catilinarian. This is a speech delivered to the people of Rome. The Senate has met and Catiline has fled. The consul now explains his action to the people of Rome in an oration given from the rostrum in the Forum. Cicero begins by explaining why he had to be careful and why he could not simply execute Catiline, since not everyone accepted his theory of the conspiracy. There is an epistemic gap. Cicero again fills it with evidence of, or less with evidence or argument than with fantasy and invective. This would have been a typical and expected part of Roman oratory. Cicero proceeds to list the reasons we should fear Catiline and hence why the Roman people should support their consul against the conspiracy. He first mentions Catiline took with him a certain Tongilius, who had long been the object of Catiline's affections, as well as other garden variety wastrels. But Catiline, he says, has left behind many powerful, indebted, and debauched young men who we should fear far more. Young men, quote, gleaming with lotions. What debts they have, what power, what noble birth. The cluster of ideas associating scandalous and alluring forms of sexual enjoyment with debt, violence, and revolution continues throughout, as it did in the first Catilinarian. But Cicero makes a division here. While he comes before the people as a defender of the constitutional order, and thus as a senator and a member of the elite, he does so also as a new man, as one who, like those whom he addresses, has no long line of aristocratic ancestors and inherited wealth behind him. These well-moisturized young men are those whom we should fear. These dissolute scions of inherited wealth and privilege who squander fortunes we can scarcely imagine. We bond together in our opposition to them, in the violence of our hatred, our fear, our envy. Nonetheless, as the images of those who indulge their appetites these same young men are those who we secretly long to be. The bonds of shared passion and hatred to unite us against them, that constitute us, the people, as the people, are smeared with fantasies we harbor of obscene enjoyment. We are invited to imagine their shining faces, their scent, the softness of their touch. What other man has ever presented such great temptations to the young as he? Some of them he had sex with in the most disgraceful way, while with others he scandalously submitted himself to their own sexual impulses. To some he promised whatever they hankered after, to others the death of their parents, and not merely by urging them on, but by giving active help. And how quickly he succeeded in assembling a vast crowd of the worst of society, and not only from the city, but from the countryside as well. Not only at Rome, but even in the furthest corners of Italy. There was not a single debtor whom he failed to recruit to this extraordinary criminal alliance. Catiline is a monster of enjoyment. And as auditors and readers, we both assume the passion of Cicero and we picture what he asks us to imagine, a monstrous man surrounded by louche, well-oiled young men. Some of them he penetrates in ways that would be unacceptable for free young men in Rome, emasculating them, putting them in the position of a slave who serves other pleasures with their body. Others he allows to penetrate him, rendering him a bizarre sexual omnivore who is able to occupy all positions and yet somehow retain his power. To some he promised to gratify their urges, fructum libidinum. To others, the murder of their parents. Debtors, foreigners, those without a propertied stake in the existing order of free, respectable men whose orifices are closed. Men who only penetrate others in the approved manner. They are all breathing together, conspirant. Can't you just imagine it? Can't you just picture it? We must stop it, lest we all start breathing faster, together, conspiratus, in unison. Lest all property and propriety be swept away into a single pulsing pit of passion, with no distinction between free and slave, actor and acted upon, viewer and viewed. The truth of his assertions are warranted precisely by our rage and enjoyment. Quote, so that you can appreciate the diversity of his interests and the full range of his activities, there is no gladiator in a training school who inclines ever so slightly to crime, who does not also boast of his close relationship with Catiline. And on the other hand, there is no actor at all fickle and useless who does not also claim to be just about his dearest friend. Gladiators and actors in Rome were normally slaves or freedmen. In the Roman imagination, they were like unto prostitutes. They were those who gave pleasure to others with their bodies. Their bodies were not their own, but functioned as the objects of others. This was the problem with Catiline's behavior, or more precisely with what we are invited to imagine as Catiline's behavior, since Cicero offers not a scintilla of evidence that any of this is any truer than QAnon's most lurid Pizzagate dreams. The problem wasn't that he wanted to have sex with men. That would have been widely conceded as reasonable and normal. But he wanted to have sex with free-born aristocratic young men, men whose bodies are imagined to be impenetrable, men who, if they are penetrated, are rendered subject to another's pleasure and hence objects rather than subjects, women rather than men, slave rather than free. Catiline is himself both penetrating and penetrated. He is both a respectable aristocrat from an ancient patrician family, a Roman senator, and yet no different from a gladiator, an actor, or a prostitute. He is the monstrous other who inheres within the carefully cultivated distinctions on which the constitutional order rests, the fantasy of its own conflagration against which we must erect an impenetrable shield. Nonetheless, from each of these encounters, from each of these trials by sexual, financial, and political fire, he emerges not weakened or emasculated, but heightened in his potency. Quote, Catiline himself, as a result of his repeated sexual misconduct and criminal activity, had acquired the ability to endure cold, hunger, thirst, and lack of sleep, and was therefore hailed as a hero to people of this sort, close quote. He is a kind of perverse Superman. At this point, it is worth returning to our initial passage from the De Officiis. Quote, in addition to this desire of seeing the true, there is a certain hunger, appetitio, for preeminence, so that the well-formed soul does not wish to obey anyone except someone who is instructing or teaching justly for the sake of what is useful and commanding legitimately, whence arises a greatness of soul and contempt of human affairs. And truly that force, vis of nature and reason, is not small, because only this animal senses what order may be, what is fitting, and what may be the limit in words and deeds. Read in conjunctions with the Catilinarians, this passage provokes certain questions. How do we understand our desire for the true in relation to cupiditas more generally, in relation to Catiline's desires? What is the epistemic status of our cupiditas and of our appetite for preeminence, and hence for at least figurative domination? How is knowledge related to pleasure and enjoyment? Are these appetites, desires, and drives opposed or complementary to our understanding of the true? Is there not on some level, as in Kant and Burke's theories of the sublime, Is there not on some level, as in the Kant and Burke's theories of the sublime, on which we experience that which exceeds the capacity of our understanding, a literal enormity, so that it comes to function as a warrant of the real, of an authenticity beyond pretense? It is clear that we are to understand Catiline as one who is overmastered by his desires and appetites. But it is equally clear that in order to move us to recognize this truth and the danger Catiline represents to the continued existence of Rome, as conceded by all the ancient commentators, Cicero invites us to imagine and embody his very desires. This invitation is not issued in opposition to reason, nor to the Republic, that makes possible our ability to engage in public deliberation, and hence to engage in the contest of logoi that makes life livable for a human being. Rather, it is the very condition of possibility for that Republic's existence, for the continued existence of that order that makes the pursuit of truth and preeminence possible. However sublimated it may be, our pursuit, acceptance, and preservation of truth, of a life of truth, of a form of communal life that permits the existence of a life livable for a human being, is dependent on our prior libidinal investments, on the force of those investments in and through reason itself, in and through the possibility of making statements performed, received, and experienced as true. On the Ides of March in 44 BCE, when Julius Caesar was stabbed to death on the steps of the Senate, Brutus, one of the leaders of the conspiracy, a recipient of Caesar's clemency, and believed by some to be his illegitimate son, held up a bloody dagger and shouted out one word of explanation: Cicero. Killing Caesar, he seemed to say, was equivalent to the execution of the Catilinarian conspirators, a violent, extra-legal act, but necessary to preserve the Republic. The assassination was an act of fury, a collective unleashing of the death drive. In the aftermath, Caesar's death will convulse Rome with civil war. It will eventually lead to the gruesome execution of Cicero himself. On one level, it is a moment that is founded on the claims of universal reason. Brutus himself was a Stoic philosopher. Caesarian autocracy represented the end of the Republic and the subordination of reason to the rule of one man. But it was also a singularly paroxystic moment of bloodletting. Brutus's cry seems to say the act would not have taken place without Cicero's words, without the truths he uttered and the passions he unleashed. The bloody dagger is not the conclusion of a syllogism, nor is it the product of pure reason. But neither is it a moment of madness or sheer irrationality. It marks a middle space in which both reason and passion have led to a moment of decision. The cupiditas for truth, as found in universal reason and the Roman Republic, has led to a use of force, vis, that in itself cannot be dissociated from our appetitio for preeminence, from a drive for domination. This cupiditas, this appetitio, is irreducible to the mere calculation of pleasure, to a dispassionate weighing of costs and benefits. Brutus's bloody dagger does not invoke Cicero as one who gave him sound advice, as someone who has suggested a beneficial course of action in the manner of a life coach or an accountant. But rather, he casts Cicero as an ethical figure, one on par with Antigone and her splendor, as someone who has invoked a principle that is beyond the law. For Cicero, there is no truth abstracted from the lives of actual people who live in communities and seek to persuade one another of its value, people who make arguments about excellence, virtue, and the law. There is no persuasion that is not founded on the truths of embodied citizens, people who dream, who lust, who fantasize, people subject to drives they do not fully control or understand. The challenge is to describe the nexus between these elements, between the universal and the particular, philosophy and rhetoric, truth and enjoyment. It is this nexus that makes Cicero so important for our time, when Republican government generally is challenged by authoritarianism and autocracy, when truth as a fundamental value is under relentless attack, and when the forces of the death drive seem as untamed as they have at any time since the Stalinist purges and the Nazi death camps. When we think of Cicero with all his faults and frailties, his vanities and his vacillation, we too can take heart from his courage and, yes, his splendor. As Timothy Snyder gently admonishes us in the final lesson of On Tyranny, quote, "Be as courageous as you can. If none of us is prepared to die for freedom, then all of us will die under tyranny." Thank you.
Thank you so much, Alan, for this great lecture. I would say lecture performance. I was thinking during this lecture performance that you are a great orator, and then I thought it's not surprising you're also an expert on rhetoric, so it needs to be. But really, thank you so much. I found it fascinating how you bridge the gap between ancient time and our challenges today. And I can imagine that there are some first questions and remarks in the audience.
Let me just say, I hope you enjoyed it. Been waiting for that joke.
Okay. There is a first question.
Well, two questions.
Wait for the microphone, please.
Thank you so much. That was wonderful. I have two very, petty questions, I'd say. One is about the argument Crosses makes in the oratory. Isn't that just the same as Aristotle claims in De Anima? Where's the difference? Why is that a Ciceronian approach to truth? Because it sounds pretty much like the orexis for knowledge in De Anima. So I'm just struck by the parallels, sort of. And my second question is about the apotropaic function you mentioned towards the end of your talk. If we have to understand Catiline's cupiditas in order to see that it's dangerous, where's the difference from other apotropaic symbols or evocations in ancient culture?
So in terms of the Aristotle, you're talking about the passage from the De Officiis that I quote twice, right? And there's a lot of influence of the Peripatetics in the De Officiis. One of the things about Cicero, and it's one of the things that has caused him to not be well studied by modern philosophers, is he's very eclectic and pulls things from a lot of different ancient sources. This has led to the general claim that he is unoriginal and derivative and therefore not worth studying. I don't think that's true. I think it is the nature of being a neo-academic. So now I'm going to be a little bit technical about ancient philosophy here. But as a neo-academic, he accepts the fact that on the one hand, there is no absolute truth, but what we always seek is the most plausible, and we can get the most plausible from a variety of sources. We're not sworn to a particular method. So interestingly, De Officiis largely works from Panaetius, who is a Stoic, but Cicero does not scruple at bringing in Aristotle. And so what is original about him, I would say, is in fact what is original about most, say, postmodern thinkers, who in fact work largely through collage, parody, commentary, rather than saying, I have an original system, you know, I'm the next Hegel. The last person to really try to do that, at least with some success, was probably Sartre, you know, this is what he is given much grief for by the next generation of scholars, perhaps unfairly sometimes, but you know, so Cicero, interestingly enough, in the last 10, 15 years as a philosophical thinker, has enjoyed something of a renaissance, which he hasn't really seen since the 18th century. And that, I think, is largely because his method of philosophizing, in fact, you know, fits very well with people from Derrida to Lyotard to people like Rorty and people in the American pragmatic tradition. And the other question was on...
apotropaics.
Oh, apotropaic. How is this different from other apotropaic uses? Not much. Yeah.
Thank you. I guess then I understood what you said.
Yeah.
Yeah, I have to second Daniela and Monica, that it was a splendid, I would say, performance of you. And I think also a very, very, how can I say, very good, it's better than good, display of jouissance and the death drive and eros and the life drive. And I know it's a common obsession of the two of us.
Yes.
But I think what when you began to talk about Antigone, you know, I think you did a wonderful job of showing how quickly we can be seduced by a good cause.
Right.
And how little it takes to go the other way, you know. And I think what was wonderful, among many other things, was how often I think we all thought of the present times. You know, you put a Trump in that position versus an Antigone, but it's the same forces. And it's so, I think this so explains, on one hand, life and death drive, but also how fickle human nature is, you know, since antiquity. So thank you very much for that.
Oh, is that...
I don't have a question, I just have a...
So I just say in response that I think one of the really interesting things about Antigone is if you know Jean Anouilh's Antigone, one of the really fascinating things about it is that it was widely celebrated by the Allies as a play of resistance against the Nazis. It was equally well reviewed by the Nazi press and generally thought to be a pro-fascist play. You know, so when we deal, part of my larger argument is we have to recognize the force of enjoyment. We have to see how it functions in persuasion. We have to be willing to get our hands dirty with it, but we should not fool ourselves about how dangerous it is.
Ferocious, I would say.
Thank you. Brilliant speech. Be thinking about this for a long time. My field comes from theater, and that which emerges not just out of the mind, but of the body. And so I'm thinking a lot about the ways in which these forces that you're describing, and you know, I'm very important to me. Years ago, was reading. We've talked about this.
Yeah.
Beyond the Pleasure Principle, and the impact was just wonderful being in his study this morning and this afternoon, just thinking about how his interpretation of Greek drama really led to 20th century drama directly and sometimes in correspondence. My question has to do with this death force. What did you? Sorry.
Death drive.
Death drive. Sorry.
Yeah.
The death drive's relationship to taboo, the death drive's relationship to carnality, the uncanny, the supernatural, the relationship of what would be called devil worship or love of, embrace of historical sacrifice and trying to bring that into it. And I really think the connection that you make to the ways in which we are entertaining ourselves with the death drive continually. And it's not necessarily on one side of the political spectrum or another. It seems almost something between what we call the mind and the heart, or between the brain and the lower regions. Like, it's the degree to which we try to balance as people that, and our drama does, I say our drama, I'm not just meaning theater, but, all forms from video games on. But I'm just wondering how much of the death drive is related to transgressive and regressive, decivilizing, as much as it is a balance against truth. Your thoughts?
That's a really big and very pertinent question. So I'm going to start by going to your notion that, how much the death drive figures in forms of entertainment, and not always in a bad way. As I like to tell my students, I'm a complete sucker for Madama Butterfly. I cry every time I see it. And it's a story very much about the death drive, as is almost all of Puccini. So, it's not all splatter films, Is it about transgression? Totem and taboo comes before beyond the pleasure principle. But, in Freud's myth in Totem and Taboo, we have the father of enjoyment, this sort of obscene father who has all the women and all the things, and of course, he has to be killed. And of course, in that killing, we unleash a force that frightens the band of brothers, and that also produces a certain guilt. And so you create the totem, of the dead father, and you also create a set of taboos to try to not have this replicate itself again and again and again. And yet that image of the father of enjoyment, of the obscene father as opposed to the good father, lurks behind us and is very much a power of the death drive. Jean and I were discussing over coffee the other day, Trump as the obscene father of enjoyment. I mean, the fact that he's, pays off porn stars actually helps him. People fantasize about being him, golden toilets, eating steak every night and telling the world to fuck off, But it's also, not everybody gets to do that, right? So there is the father figure as the transgression, but it's also the force that puts that person in the position of domination that allows that to function, And so, you have to have the taboo function. That comes before Beyond the Pleasure Principle, but I think it's really sort of, in some ways, his mind is thinking about that. Of course, what really leads to Beyond the Pleasure Principle, at least if you believe what he says in Beyond the Pleasure Principle, is his work with traumatized war veterans from the First World War. You know, I mean, he's drafting it in 1919, finishes it and publishes it in 1920. And, you know, one of the questions that he's faced with is, why do people coming back from the war develop these repetition compulsions, where they just do things that make no sense over and over again that you cannot explain by the pleasure principle. And so if you sort of take that, and I think you put this understanding, and again, a mythic understanding that you see in Totem and Taboo, I think you get very much what you were just talking about.
Yeah, I'm going to stay with that.
So forgive me if that's something that you mentioned or tried to elaborate. Maybe I wasn't following. But I was thinking about your explanation on Antigone, and I had to think of Hegel's argument on Antigone. And if I remember correctly, then Antigone for Hegel is a figure that's somehow beyond the abstract norm of the law, just does what she thinks or feels is right. So she's also kind of a moral figure in my understanding. And because you mentioned many times in your lecture that there, for Cicero at least, there is no absolute truth. I asked myself all the time during your lecture, what is the difference then between Antigone on the one hand, or if I may add, the Ukrainian soldiers that are dying for the sovereignty of their country. They face death. They know that they're gonna die, but they're still doing it. And on the other hand, the other form of jouissance, the MAGA enthusiasts that storm the Capitol, and so where is the difference? How does it relate to the concept of truth that jouissance or the death drive or this kind of irrational rationality, or however you want to call it? Yeah. So how does it differentiate? Where is the place? Where differentiate?
Great question. I'm going to bypass the Hegel for the moment, because that's a whole can of worms about Hegel's interpretation of Antigone, and just go directly to your question about MAGA versus the Ukrainian soldiers. And so I don't think the death drive has a political color to it. I think if we want to understand contemporary politics, we have to reckon with jouissance and the death drive. I think what Cicero would argue, not again that there is a single abstract universal truth that you can simply deduce and therefore tell people what to do, which is in fact the antithesis of living in a republican form of government. You know, that is an autocracy, perhaps a theocracy in some cases, but is that what he is willing to die for, and he does die for, is the possibility of what Socrates says makes life livable for a human being, which is this possibility of pursuing through discourse what is excellence, what should human beings be doing. Notice he doesn't say, here is what human beings should be doing, and what we should be doing is forcing other people to do that. You know? So understanding that exists for people with bodies who desire, who have enjoyment, and who will be persuaded by that enjoyment is important. I think Plato understands that. I mean, if you read the Symposium, it is all about eros. You know, that is not an accident. You know, if you read the Phaedrus, Socrates' great speech where the chariot of the soul is seeing the forms is also about being in love with boys. So that we tend to think of Plato as this very dualistic thinker, and on certain levels he was, but in fact he understood this power in a way that I would kind of argue Aristotle doesn't. Did I say a word against Aristotle? I think if you go back to this notion, what is Cicero willing to die for? Is it the same thing that Catiline is willing to die for? What Catiline's willing to die for is ultimately his personal power. He lost. He can't accept losing. Does this sound familiar? So he tries to overthrow the government. We may fault Cicero for all sorts of things, and believe me, he is a very fallible character. If you read his letters, he hems and he haws, and he's often cowardly. But in the end, when it really counts, he knows when. So he writes this series of speeches called the Philippics, which are a series of denunciations of Mark Antony, who is Caesar's continuator in the government after Caesar's assassination. I don't say heir because that's actually Octavian, but he's the guy who continues on leading the Caesarian party. And you think the Catilinarians are vicious. The Philippics are really vicious. Cicero knows that if he loses, they're not going to make up and be friends afterwards. But he also says repeatedly that, what we are talking about here is whether the Republic continues. The Roman Republic was hardly flawless. Talk about slavery, and talk about all sorts of horrible things. But it wasn't an autocracy. And it's actually the longest lived republic in the world, 500 years. So, the American Republic, too, is hardly flawless. But I'm willing to say it's probably better for America to continue to be a republic than to become an autocracy.
Can I add just one
Sure.
association? I have to think of, I think it's very plausible what you say, and I have to think of one passage in Freud's Beyond the Pleasure Principle where he says, the Keimzelle, so I don't know how it translates to English, but the Keim, like the basic cell, so to say.
The
atomos.
The germ cells is the way
germ cells, yeah.
Straight Chief translates
in Eros, if I remember correctly, they sacrifice themselves for this proto-state that is Eros, the force that builds. And this could be then the Republic, whereas the cell that is the basis of the death drive is narcissistic in nature, I think Freud says. So maybe that's a clue also. Yeah,
I mean, narcissism is a complicated topic in Freud, but it is narcissistic in the kind of secondary narcissistic sense as opposed to primary narcissism, in that it is unable to form attachments with others. One of Cicero's in De Officiis, so I read the passage about desire and all that, but one of the things he talks about consistently there is, what does it mean to have a society, a societas? And a society is a group of allies, partners. A socius is an ally or a partner. And he says we naturally desire that. So it's not a kind of social contract theory where, we're all scared of each other and so we form a government to limit each other's freedom so that, somebody doesn't come and steal our stuff. it is more that we naturally desire to be with one another, and what we want to build is a community of people helping one another. You know, again, you know, you can point out contradictions in his own life, etc. But I think as an ideal, as something that would help us differentiate between good and bad forms of this, you know, asking yourself, does this lead to an actual societas, or does this lead to a situation where we are using each other as tools as opposed to allies and partners, is a good way to think about it.
So maybe if there are no more questions, I do as myself ask a very last question. Also, again, about the concept or word of truth, because I just wanted to ask you to share a little bit with us the distinction which you find in the translation of Cicero between the search for the true and the search for truth. Because the quotes you were showing, often we had the desire, the search for the true,
right,
not the truth.
Yeah, that's... So on a philological level, I'm not sure I can defend that there's an absolute distinction there. Because there are times, frankly, when he seems to use those interchangeably. One is verum, which is just the true, and one is veritas, truth. But if we think about, I mean, Cicero was a great writer. And so he thought, and he chose his words very carefully. And so I would like to think that the truth is often something that we can posit but we cannot obtain. But we can have moments of the true. And I think, that's basically what Cicero's argument is in terms of being a neo-academic, where he wants to say, we're going to get together, and he has a lot of dialogues like this. They're not the ones I'm talking about, but where we have people from different perspectives defending different philosophical positions. And then oftentimes they don't lead to a conclusion. You're supposed to leave with your understanding of, at least within that interchange, what the true is. At the same time, understanding that none of these positions necessarily reach the truth in the sense that discourse stops, that the search for truth stops. Yeah.
Okay.
One small question or comment. I'm wondering whether the distinction that you are also asking for is a distinction sort of on clinical terms between hysteria and aversion. The hysteric being the one who searches for the truth, and maybe in some way the perverse who is exposing the dirty truth. But in a book, I forgot the enigmatic message of the hysteric, Lucien Israel speaks a lot about the hysteric really being a truth seeker and sort of risking her life symptomatically for the truth of her own sexuality.
I love that. I mean, that's great. And I have to say, one of the most wonderful things about being at the Freud Museum for a semester is that I have had encounters with people who are analysts, who think about things from a clinical way, whereas, as a professor of comparative literature, I basically deal with other professors of literature. And we're great people, but it's important to think of to make those distinctions and step back and go, wait, and yeah, that makes sense to me.
if there are no more questions, I would like to say a huge thank you to you, Ellen, for this wonderful lecture, to you, dear audience, for your questions and remarks. And of course, it's hard to close such an evening without finding a bridge to Freud and the truth. And let me just tell you that maybe you don't know it, but there is a beautiful text by Stefan Zweig written in 1931 where he would describe Freud as a Wahrheitssadist.
Oh.
So so there is another notion, sadism, which comes into play, which I would like to give you.
Oh, I thank you. No, I need to I need to read that text, and let me tell you just a brief story. So I'm walking home on Kochgasse the other day, and there was this group of students and a teacher, and they come up to me and they go, "Do you know where the Stefan Zweig house is?" And I didn't, but it turned out it was like a block and a half from my house. So they show me, and they're lost, so I lead them there. So I consider that prophetic for...
So thank you again, and have a nice evening.